listener production.
Hello, Sacha Barbour-Gatt with you for today's episode of The Briefing. Nuclear energy is shaping up to be one of the hot topics of the next federal election, which could be happening in less than a year's time. The coalition is set to pursue the creation of nuclear power plants here, despite it being banned in 1998. But did you know polling is already happening at suggested nuclear power sites around Australia?
We're very confident of the support that we've seen in these communities for nuclear energy to be looked at in their backyards, because they see the opportunity, they see the safety, but they see the opportunity of high-paying jobs in their regions.
Today I'm joined by Nationals leader David Littleproud to get a sense of the coalition's nuclear power strategy ahead of what is set to be a fraught debate in the lead up to the 2025 federal election. First though, let's get today's top stories with Antoinette Lattouf. It is Wednesday the 22nd of May.
Thanks, Sasha. G'day, everyone. A man has died and dozens more have been injured after a London to Singapore flight was hit by severe turbulence. It dropped 6,000 feet, which is around 1.8 kilometres, in just a few minutes. Singapore Airlines flight SQ321 left Heathrow early yesterday morning with 211 passengers on board, and that includes 56 Australians. But it was forced to divert to Bangkok after the incident. And footage shows passengers smashing into the ceiling and rubbish and belongings thrown around the plane. And here's how one of the passengers described it, speaking with the BBC.
Suddenly the plane plunged, I don't know how far, but it was a long way and so sudden, there was no warning at all. And I ended up hitting my head on the ceiling, my wife did. Some poor people who were walking around ended up doing somersaults. It was absolutely terrible. And then suddenly it stopped and it was calm again. The staff did their best to tend to the injured people. There were a lot of them. And some of the staff were injured themselves, so they did a sterling job.
Yeah, wow, it sounds incredibly disturbing. 7 people were critically injured, including a crew member, and it's been reported that the man who lost his life was a British passenger who was starting a 6-week holiday with his wife. And from what we've heard, the 73-year-old grandfather suffered a heart attack.
I've seen the footage, Antoinette, and it is so horrifying. These poor people just thrown around this plane, and it's no wonder so many were injured in this instance. It's worth noting more than 4 billion people fly every year, but only 30 deaths have ever been attributed to turbulence. And there are concerns as well that turbulence incidents will increase by the years 2050 to 2080. And that's because of climate change, which has been found to have a link to instances of what's called clear air turbulence. And the problem with that is that it hits suddenly and it's not associated with storms, so it's really hard to avoid for pilots. Now, people who were not injured seriously have been able to continue with their travel. And as you mentioned, 56 Australians were on board and were actually the highest represented nationality on this flight as well. Now, friends and relatives who might have had family on board the plane, and if they're seeking information, they can call the Australian Singapore Airlines hotline for further info. That number is 1800 845 313.
Sacha, as you mentioned, death by turbulence is obviously very rare, but I guess this is a really good reminder to keep that seatbelt on when you're not up going to the loo. And, you know, given that based on climate change, these instances of severe turbulence are going to increase.
Australia will ban replicas of drugs like Ozempic amidst surging demand for its weight loss properties. Health Minister Mark Butler will announce the move, designed to stamp out compounding pharmacies from making their own versions of the injections. It is believed as many as 20,000 Australians have bought them.
So global supplies of the drugs Ozempic and Manjaro have been affected since a number of celebrities admitted to or were suspected of using them to drop kilos. Hello, Kardashian-Jenner family. The new regulations will remove the active ingredient in the injections from an exemption list that allows pharmacies to compound them, and that'll come into effect from October. And the government says that this move is aimed at disrupting the businesses that are capitalising on ballooning demand. And I don't know about you, Sacha, but I know at least half a dozen people in my circle who are using Ozempic who don't have diabetes and who are using it for weight loss benefits and haven't had a difficult time getting it. And people like I wouldn't necessarily expect, just kind of random people in my life, and are using it for its weight loss benefits.
Yeah, well, no one I know has told me that they're using it, but I was at the pharmacy the other day and the lady in front of me said, "Oh, sorry, do you have Ozempic needles?" And, you know, that person might have had diabetes, but it was the first time I'd kind of experienced it in person with someone trying to access this drug, whether for diabetes or for weight loss. The scary thing with what is happening is this compounding. So pharmacists can compound drugs if the main supplier isn't available, but that's on a case-by-case basis and only if the person has a prescription. It is not meant to happen at this commercial scale that we're seeing, and the big concern is that those compounded medicines are not being regulated by the TGA. There's no oversight of them. And when these regulations come into effect, civil and criminal penalties under the Therapeutic Goods Act could apply to anyone who breaches these new regulations. So it's obvious the government has felt it's needed to respond to this growing demand for something that, you know, could be dangerous. The US Food and Drug Administration is probing the risk of more serious side effects associated with these drugs, including hair loss and potentially suicidal ideation as well.
Anthony Albanese has been ducking questions over the International Criminal Court's decision to seek arrest warrants for leaders of Israel and Hamas. The International Criminal Court's Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan is seeking arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, his defence minister and 3 Hamas leaders over alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. But when asked about it yesterday, Anthony Albanese sidestepped the question.
I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally, of which Australia is not a party. We've said that every life matters, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian, and we've called for progress towards a 2-state solution.
So this prompted opposition leader Peter Dutton to call for a stronger condemnation of the decision to pursue Israel, which is obviously Australia's ally, who we support politically and militarily.
Yeah, Peter Dutton says the actions of the ICC are anti-Semitic and that it was, quote, utterly repugnant to compare the Israeli Prime Minister to a terrorist organisation leader. So this was after Albo made his comments. Peter Dutton wanted stronger condemnation. So in response to Dutton's comments, a spokesperson for the Foreign Minister later released a statement saying that Australia respects the ICC and its important role in upholding international law, also saying there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organisation.
I think it's interesting, Sacha, to hear Joe Biden's reaction, which is not surprising. So the US president called the ICC's move outrageous, and he declared, "What's happening in Gaza is not genocide. We reject that." But I don't expect anything less, given the US is all but aiding, funding and arming Israel's brutality. So I doubt that Biden would get up and say, yeah, well, we accept this. I get it. Let's, put them both in the naughty corner.
Something else that's happened overnight that's prompted quite swift condemnation. Israel has it has dismantled the Associated Press's live feed stream of Gaza. It had a camera feed set up and Israeli officials moved in and pulled the camera down, so the live feed has been cut. And the White House has said it's looking into this incident. And the concern is around journalists being able to do their jobs, which is to report on what is happening on the ground in Gaza. And this was a live stream feed. It was simply showing what was happening. We've also heard from the Israeli opposition leader in this, Yair Lapid, who posted on X that the confiscation of the equipment is an act of madness. So pretty strong condemnation from a lot of different leaders there. And there might be a never-ending feud between Sydney and Melbourne over which city is the best place to live. But a new international ranking has one unlikely spot beating them both, and that is Canberra. Oxford Economics has named the Aussie capital as the second best in the world, yes, the entire globe, for quality of life, Antoinette.
This took me as a surprise because each city was scored across 5 categories: economics, human capital, quality of life, the environment and governance. And the only listed drawback for Canberra was its environment, and that's according to the ranking, and that's due to factors like climate and air quality. And the only other thing that surprised me more was that I didn't recognise the city that was in place number 1. It's the French mountainous city of Grenoble. Have you heard of Grenoble? Grenoble? I don't know how to pronounce it.
No, I haven't heard of this place. Yeah, it sounds like this quality of life ranking was a little bit rogue because there was a list of the overall best cities, quote unquote, and that one had a lot more recognisable names. New York topped it, then London, then San Jose. When it came to Australia, Melbourne was the top ranking Aussie city. That came in 9th. Sydney was 16th, Perth 23rd, Brisbane 27th, Canberra in that one ranked 44th, and Adelaide was 51st. I quite like Canberra. I think it's a good place to visit. There's plenty to do. It's nice and clean and well maintained, and there is actually a burgeoning food scene. So I enjoyed Canberra the last time I went.
Yeah, I'm there this weekend. I usually only go for a couple of days. I think people just associate it. The reason it's maligned is because we associate it with politicians. But it does have beautiful scenery and, as you say, some great restaurants and lots of great things to do outdoors. So it seems like the list of the best cities is quite different to the list of those that are best to live in. So I'd imagine that would take into account congestion and cost of living and all of those other factors.
Yeah, exactly. Well, enjoy your trip to Canberra. I, for one, am jealous. Enjoy one of the best places in the world to live for quality of life. That is all for the headlines. Thank you, Antoinette. Next up is my chat with David Littleproud, the leader of the Nationals, about the coalition's plans for nuclear in Australia. The need for clean and reliable electricity is becoming increasingly desperate. Coal currently produces about 2/3 of Australia's power needs. We have committed to and legislated net zero emissions by 2050, but given the urgency of the climate crisis, some experts say we should be aiming to achieve that goal as soon as 2035. Many would agree that renewable energy, that is wind, hydro and solar, is the way to go. But the Liberals and Nationals are gearing up for a fight on nuclear power, arguing it'll provide cheap and green electricity while boosting jobs and avoiding the need to connect wind and solar farms to the grid by building reactors at existing coal sites. Given the PR nightmare nuclear power still faces in this country, not to mention the federal ban on building reactors, which has been in place for more than 25 years, the coalition is facing an uphill battle to win support for its policy. Joining me now to talk about it is the leader of the Nationals, David Littleproud. Minister, thanks for your time today. The coalition's due to release its plan for nuclear power in the next few weeks. Can you give us a sneak peek?
Well, we've been very upfront that the nuclear power plants we will put in place, about 6 or 7 of them, will be where existing coal-fired power stations are. So that limits it to a geographical area. There's about 16 or 17 existing coal-fired power stations. But what we're working through now is to make sure that there is some rigour around those locations to support not just the grid but also manufacturing. And the challenge that we've got is that an all-renewables approach will not underpin manufacturing in this country. Batteries and wind turbines simply can't do it, and you need to be able to have baseload power. We're going to lose 90% of our baseload power by 2030 because of this all-renewables approach. So it's important that we have an energy mix and we don't have concentration risk. We don't put all our energy eggs in one basket, and we transition slowly from coal to some nuclear with gas and carbon capture storage we put in the right place and renewables.
I wanted to ask you about recent polling that the coalition did of these electorates where potential future nuclear generators could be built. You say the response was very supportive. What are locals telling you about their thoughts on nuclear energy in their backyards?
Yeah, it's the opportunity for jobs, and I think there's an acceptance now that we've moved past 1950s technology. That this is done safely in 19 of the 20 G20 countries. In fact, in Japan, where the last incident was around a tsunami, and we haven't had too many tsunamis in Australia. Japan is actually reopening all their nuclear power plants, as well as building a new 1,200 megawatt nuclear plant. They want to have a mix, an energy mix of gas, nuclear and renewables, and that's the sensible approach that will be similar to ours. What they do see is these jobs that will be lost out of coal-fired power stations that can be transitioned across and pay even more. So they're high-paying jobs. They see a future for their region if they're an energy sector remains in these communities. And they are very energy literate. They actually understand the energy sector. These aren't wind towers and solar panels that come down every 5 to 15 years. This will be there for 60 to 70 years and beyond. So that's why they see a long-term future for their region.
Will you release the results of the polling and as well as the locations where you have done this polling where nuclear generators could be built when you release your energy plan?
We won't be releasing our polling, but you'll be able to see where we've done it by the locations that we've announced. We want to make sure that the community supports this in some way. And obviously, we wanted to be open and honest about understanding that before we make these announcements. But you'll see exactly where they are. We will be upfront with the Australian people and those communities. And I'm sure there'll be many more polls after we've announced these locations, but we're very confident of the support that we've seen in these communities for nuclear energy to be looked at in their backyards because they see the opportunity, they see the safety, but they see the opportunity of high-paying jobs in their regions.
Look, I want to get to some of the well-documented arguments that come up inevitably when nuclear power is discussed. My question is around the expense. So I understand your party's looking at this new technology, these small modular reactors, estimates that you'd need 70 in order to completely power the grid at a cost of over $300 billion. Why does the coalition want to pursue nuclear energy when you compare that to renewables, which is about $320 billion to power the whole grid?
No, well, let me just put that in perspective. They're Chris Bowen's numbers. But the numbers that I will quote are from Net Zero Australia, who quote the transition to an all renewables or to 82% renewables by 2030 will cost around $1.5 trillion. And by 2050, Net Zero Australia are saying the whole transition would cost somewhere between $7 and $9 trillion. That's a lot of money. And yes, this will cost a lot of money, as will renewables. But what it does provide is baseload power. And that's what renewables can't provide, is baseload power that will be there for generations. You've got to understand that these wind factories, the actual amount of concrete that goes on them is enormous. But what it means is that at the end of their life in 15 to 20 years, you can't put another tower on top of them because the integrity of the concrete of holding such a large piece of infrastructure means you have to go and build another one. A power plant lasts for 60 to 70 years. You'll have 2 or 3 times the expenditure on renewing solar panels and wind turbines over that period, as well as what's not taken into account by all these experts is the transmission lines. See, we've done a really good job at the existing renewables that have been put in place because they've been done very close to existing transmission lines, and that was smart. But now as you want to ramp up that scale to all renewable approach, you have to go beyond and away from where existing transmission lines are. So what they're not factoring in as well is the 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines that's going to be required to support the renewables.
What about the timeline? There is no argument in terms of how long it can take nuclear power reactors and generators to get up and running and then supplying the energy that we need. Some experts say it would take decades to establish. The climate crisis is here now. I understand you want to do a mix. You don't want to, completely go nuclear straight away or maybe even ever, but you can't deny how long it takes for this technology to be established. Why would you continue to pursue something that is decades down the track?
Well, it's not decades down the track. And in fact, you can, once you've got the approvals and you take away the moratorium, you can effectively, some of the smaller nuclear plants can have up in 5 to 6 years. And that's been seen around the world. But we do have time. And this is the thing, is that we are 1% of emissions. And what we are doing at the moment is ignoring the fact that we've got till 2050, not till 2030, to be able to achieve all our international commitments. Now, we can achieve that continually. We're not walking away from that international commitment. But what we've got to do is have an orderly transition that doesn't blow our economy up. And what we've got to do is make sure that renewables will be part of that mix, and we'll continue to have renewables in that. And I believe quite passionately that if we're to have renewables, we should put them on an environment it can't destroy. It can't destroy the native habitat of our parts of the world in regional Australia or agricultural land. We should be looking at putting it on rooftops, solar on rooftops, giving energy independence to households, helping them and businesses in where the concentration of power is required and the concentration of population is. That makes sense.
Minister, you said we've got time. Some experts think that we should be aiming for net zero much, much sooner than the 2050 target and are starting to pressure the federal government to move it forward into the 2030s. Do you not agree that the climate crisis is at a crucial point right now that we should be doing more than what we've legislated, not less?
Well, the pressure should be on countries like China and India. Australia is less than 1% of total global emissions. So what we do will not have any real significant impact whatsoever. But what we do need to do is put pressure internationally on those big emitters, on those developing countries, and about reducing their emissions. And in fact, they are. In some of India are looking at nuclear power plants as well as renewables in terms of their grid. So what we've got to do is make sure that if we want to have real impact of reducing emissions, it's our influence on a global stage that can do that. China's made a commitment to 2060, not to 2050, and India has basically not given anything of substance. So what we need to do is make sure on the international stage we influence them, because that's how you'll change emissions. But what you've got to do is still live up to your commitments and do it sensibly. And we can do it because we do have sovereignty of all our resources. But what you're seeing at the moment, the energy bills that you're seeing at the moment, is because we've gone an all renewables approach. And we can't even achieve it by 2030. There's not the supply chain to achieve what Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese is saying by 2030. You need to lay 22,000 solar panels a day, and you need to commission 40 wind turbines a month. It's simply not achievable by 2030 because there's not even the supply chain to support that. So you've got to be sensible about this, and this is why you look at all the technology options, and that's why carbon capture storage should be something we looked at, as well as looking at starting on this nuclear debate sooner rather than later. That's why we want to have it. Not keep kicking it down the road, but to have it now, to face up to it and to actually say as a nation, this is what we can do, is exactly what the other 19 other G20 countries are doing.
Yeah, well, on the topic of that debate, the other, I suppose, huge hurdle that faces nuclear is needing to get bipartisan support. Labor has been pretty clear that it has no interest. The Greens would have a similar platform. How would you be able to get this through without that support in Parliament?
Well, that's why we go to an election. You'll have an energy policy. There'll be a clear difference between us and Labor. But there are people within Labor that strongly support this. And I think if the Australian people at the next election vote a coalition government in, that's a very strong mandate, because this will be at the forefront of the next election about us sensibly transitioning our emissions down in a uniquely Australian way, because we do have the sovereignty of all those resources that we can do that. And that's the common sense solution that we want to provide that doesn't blow up the economy. We've got to live up to our international commitments. We're not shirking that, but we're saying there's an Australian way to achieve this, and we think we can do it and do it safely for Australians that gives them a reliable energy sector into the future with zero emissions.
Minister, when will the public know your full plan for nuclear power in Australia? Can we put a date on it?
We won't give you a specific date, but it's in a matter of weeks. There's plenty of time between now and the next election, and we want to be upfront and honest with the Australian people. That's what you'll get from Peter Dutton and I, is just honesty. We'll look you in the eye, tell you how it is. So that'll be out in the coming couple of weeks.
Well, given how fraught the debate is around nuclear power, I'm sure the Australian people will hold you both to account on that one. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us today on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all for this episode. A reminder, we put out full eps of our weekend briefing chats on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom to see them. You can also catch up with our other video content on TikTok at Listener Newsroom and on Instagram, which is at The Briefing Podcast. And finally, before you go, if you did like this ep, why not share it with someone you think might enjoy it too? I'm Sacha Barbour-Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.